As a biographer, I've always thought that you can tell a lot about people by who their heroes are. And then I thought about myself, who are my heroes? And there's really only one name that popped right to the top of the list: Tom Brokaw. I started out as a young journalist. I met him when he was still in Los Angeles. He had a generosity of spirit, but more importantly, he had South Dakota values. I really mean that. He had grown up, his father was sort of a Corps of Engineers type in South Dakota. They moved from town to town. Governor Joe Foss, I think it was, became a mentor. 53 years ago, he married somebody else from South Dakota, Meredith Brokaw, who's with him. And I have always admired that notion of having decency and caring about other people, but also being a reporter, being really careful to go out and get the facts. We all remember him. I remember starting with him and John Chancellor at the conventions, all the way through Tom being there at the Berlin Wall and other places. He went out and reported, but he also did it based on values. And by being based on values, I don't mean like today where people have partisan or biased values. He believed you could bring values to your reporting without being biased. He writes about the greatest generation, but basically it was during that period when I was getting into journalism that there was the greatest generation. Tom is an exemplar of that. And there's one person I remember when I used to just love getting up and watching television, something I sometimes have to avoid a bit these days. And there was just the two of them together on the set. This is in the mid-1970s. And Jane Pauley would say, "This is today." And you'd get up and say, "I'm optimistic about the world." She, too, has been somebody who has exemplified the curiosity and decency. They've both written great books, but they've also been part of all of our lives and taught us our values. It's my great pleasure to give our award, our Public Service Award, to Tom Brokaw, and ask Jane Pauley to come join them in conversation.
I want to say thank you, Walter, for that very generous introduction. I love being with Jane. When we started on the Today Show, at the top of NBC, the executive offices were pretty much vacant, not physically, but in terms of what they wanted to do with the company. We were just afloat. And so I've often described the two of us. I came immediately from covering Watergate at the White House. Jane came from Indianapolis and then Chicago. And in effect, for the first year and a half or 2 years that we were there together, I've described it as being Das Boot. We were set afloat out on this life raft, in effect, finding our way. Things have worked out extraordinarily well for the two of us. We're both now grandparents. She met her husband at our dinner table. I thought Gary was a pal of mine, and he kept hanging around my office, and I thought, God, Gary really wants to be a close friend. And Meredith said, he doesn't want to be a close friend. He wants to meet Jane. So we had a dinner. They met, and I don't think they ever left each other's side. But the other quick thing that I want to say about an evening like this, I began my morning at the annual Robin Hood breakfast, and it reminded me as I came here tonight, there is no city in the world that is as generous and as publicly conscious of the need to give back as the city of New York. It just astonishes me. That is not hyperbole. And the great thing about this city is that you have old money families, new money families, people who are recent immigrants who come here and they join together on these kinds of occasions. And that's a great tribute to who we are, not just as New Yorkers, but as Americans. And finally, I share a street with Mike Bloomberg. We both live on 79th Street. I loved it when he was mayor because I could walk my dog at 2 in the morning and there'd be 2 cops outside his apartment. Then he didn't lose, he walked away from the mayor's job. About a month and a half ago, they decided to tear up 79th Street so they could pave it. They left it torn up for the next month and a half. That's when I knew Mike Bloomberg was no longer the mayor of New York City, because he had a share of this torn up street. But the fact is, through good times and bad, we're always New Yorkers wherever we come from, and we feel an obligation to share what we have. And I was reminded of that when I walked back in here tonight. So that's what I wanted to say.
Do you remember we were in Chicago and you forgot to put your microphone on and you couldn't find it and you're fumbling around and you were sitting on it just kind of like I was just a moment ago sitting on my microphone, and I said, you got to keep the equipment warm.
That's right. I do remember that. I was in Chicago.
What broadcasters we are. What I wanted to say was maybe the last time anyone will ever say to another person, as so many of us did, was turn your TV on, was the morning of 9/11. And at that point, America turned to its televisions in fear and terror and uncertainty, and also to find the consolation of Tom Brokaw. And to be at NBC at that time was to gather in a control room and to be a completely superfluous member. They would shoo us out and we would find our way back because we all wanted to be near Tom Brokaw too. There was something about you that said it would be okay. And I thought I would begin there tonight to ask you, do you think it's gonna be okay?
I do. I think there's a lot of anxiety out there. I don't know how the room divides itself up, but the fact is that the country and the institutions and the rule of law are stronger than any one single person. We are going through a very trying time. I think it is much more of a crossroads than we have, from a generational point of view, have been willing to acknowledge. I think it is going to be one of those defining elections to one degree or another. I do think two things. Whoever wins the presidency is going to have an enormous job of dealing with whoever is left in Congress. And for me, the single biggest issue in this election is not about Obamacare. It's not about free college for people making $125,000 or less. The single biggest issue in this election is, how do we put the country back together again? And I think that's what the big issue in this country ought to be at this point.
Well, what do you think the most underreported issue of this election has been, as we have talked so much about honesty and fitness and trustworthiness and temperament? And
yeah, I honestly believe, and I've been saying this for some time, and a couple of my colleagues are here, I met Bill Gates first and then Bill and Melinda early on, because even as the old dude, I got very interested in the digital age early on, and I've kept track of it as we've gone along. And what I believe that the most underreported part of this election is the impact of social media. The extraordinary range of opinions that are out there, very well organized, not necessarily grounded in truth, but they have taken a piece of the political landscape and claimed it for themselves. And there have been any number of instances in which there have been outrageous claims that were made. I don't know how many of you saw, for example, there was a period of time when there was a very well-constructed campaign to persuade you that Hillary Clinton had Parkinson's disease. I mean, and it was extremely well done. There were physicians that were involved in it. They were talking about the doctor holding her hand to check her pressure, about the kinds of eyeglasses that she was wearing. On the other end of the spectrum, then there are those out there who will give you, in a very persuasive, well-constructed way, the kind of gulag that will exist if Donald Trump is elected, in which all liberals will be sent there. So I do think that we have not yet sorted out the place of social media in our political dialogue. We have a ranch in a really remote part of Montana. I have a wonderful couple that works for us there. They went there because they wanted that kind of life. They're pretty much apolitical. But during the summertime, Karen will go online once or twice a week, and then she'll come across to our house, and her eyes will be as big as sausage. You're not going to believe what I read on the internet this morning. My answer is always the same. You're right, Karen. I'm not going to believe what you read on the internet this morning. And we've not yet developed a filtration system, and we need to do that. And it also, the impact of social media is not getting the attention that it deserves, I think, in the conventional forms of journalism.
40 years ago, when health, education, and anything to do with women was soft journalism, what we call back of the book. But not for you. I have specific memories of Tom Brokaw introducing those stories on the Today Show, and with far more respect than the male journalists who ran the industry at the time. This election cycle has really, really highlighted gender in so many interesting ways. But in particular, Tom, as the father of 3 daughters, do you think that we have underestimated the penalty that Hillary Clinton will pay for her gender?
I'm not sure it'll be about gender. I think that it'll be about the fact that she's been in the public eye for 30 years now. And there have been some moments that were not so good for her, and some of those were self-induced. What really is striking to me about the gender issue this time is that when Madeleine Albright is here tonight, so I don't want to embarrass her, but she later acknowledged that she made a mistake when she went to New Hampshire and said, there's a special place in hell for women who don't support a woman running for president. To the younger women who were up there, that didn't go over very well because they didn't feel attached to the need to be out there on the leading edge of it. They were making their own decisions. The millennials are the other part of this campaign turn that we're going through, who are underreported in the impact that they're going to have. Best educated, most entrepreneurial. They have uprooted the kind of life cycle that most of us have. A millennial is likely to change jobs 6 times between the ages of 21 and 32 because they're looking for satisfaction in a way that my generation certainly didn't. We went into corporations. I've been at NBC for 50 years. I figured if they're not going to find me, I'm going to stay there as long as I possibly can, as long as they're paying me these kind of good wages. Millennials don't feel that way. And they're going to change the political culture as well as the economic culture, and they're interested in doing public service and doing good works. They just don't want to be attached to the old institutions. They don't want to go to Washington. They don't want to go to work in a Capitol Hill or in the Defense Department because they find that outmoded and non-responsive to the new techniques that really motivate and drive them. So I do think it is a mix at this point. It's going to be a very big deal if Hillary Clinton gets to be elected president and is the first woman following the first African-American president. That's a twofer that I really didn't expect to see in my lifetime.
It's a big if. I remember sometime in the last week reading that after they dropped 3 of the first 4 games of the World Series, that the Cubs had the odds that they could win the World Series were greater than the odds of Donald J. Trump becoming the next president. And they did, beat the odds. So how confident are you that 1, 2, or a 3-point lead is currently, I guess,
well, first
the case?
Of all, I don't think you should pay attention to the cosmic polls. She's up by only 2 points in a national poll. That doesn't make any difference. You've got to look at it state by state. And there are a few battleground states that are critical. North Carolina is one of them, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Colorado, Wisconsin. Those are the states that you've got to look at. In the Southwest, you've got to look at New Mexico and Nevada, because at this stage of the game, it's not a national election, it's a state-by-state election. And those are the kinds of things that you have to pay attention to. People are bored with me saying this at NBC. I've been saying it for 25 years. Whenever an election cycle begins, I always raise my hand and say, wait a minute, the UFO theory always prevails. UFO stands for the unforeseen will occur. And that's been true in this campaign, beginning with Donald Trump's success. I mean, there are any number of pundits across the country who I have likened to being the people who were in the American embassy during the Iran takeover, in which they're stuffing their columns into burn furnaces, hoping nobody will ever read them again, because they were saying, he can't possibly get the nomination, he can't possibly be elected president. But the fact he has stayed in the game, in large part, I believe, because the country is ticked off in what a river guide friend of mine in Montana calls the half-cocked position. He doesn't say ticked off, he uses a more vivid phrase for that, by the way. But the country is, and it's not entirely clear about why. I think a lot of the anxiety is fed by social media. I just got back from a kind of tour of America. I was out in my home state of South Dakota. South Dakota, when I left there, was a very poor state. Farmers were not doing well. Small town merchants were getting by, and they were comfortable. Now it's prospering. It's one of the hottest states in the country to go if you want to start a business or have a job. In Sioux Falls, South Dakota, they have 1.9% unemployment, maybe 2.1 on a bad week. They have a huge meatpacking plant. They ran out of workers because people could go and get other good jobs. They have 1,500 Ethiopians, Somalis, Ukrainians, Eritreans, Syrians who have been brought here under a special program to work in those jobs. And they're thrilled to have them. They've got their families in town. The Lutheran Social League is integrating them into the community, and they're doing fine. And they're not out raping and killing and doing the things that they're accused of doing as new immigrants. That's the story of this country, and that's going on in a lot of other places as well.
I have one more thing, that I'd like to talk about in this context. I was surprised to learn that of the 5 moderators of the debates in town halls this year, 4 of them were registered Republicans and 1 was a registered Democrat, which surprised me that you can find that out. Well, of course you can. You're a reporter, except that, Tom, I don't know, as long as I've known you, and we are close friends, I don't think I know your political affiliation.
I'm registered, declined to state. I've never registered in a political party. I've always said I don't want to be a part of that. Now, in fairness, I did grow up as the child of parents who worshipped at the altar of FDR because he saved their lives. My parents both came out of the hardest days of the Depression in South Dakota, and for as long as I can remember, my mother was what we kind of laughingly called in our family a dirt road Democrat. She was one of the few in some of those small towns where Main Street was very Republican. But my mother was a big Democrat, and my dad worked for the federal government. After the war, he went to work for the Corps of Engineers, and frankly, all that saved their lives. My mother worked in the post office, my dad worked for the Corps. He was a heavy equipment operator, having big, heavy construction equipment, and he got good benefits. And they did big public service projects. They built big dams on the Missouri River, and they got employment for all the people who'd gone through the Depression and then through the war. And so I had this magical childhood between the age of 7 or 8 and when I was 15 until I moved to Yankton, thank God, and met Meredith, which was another big project that they were working on. And that generation came out of all that. They got these good jobs. They made money. They sent their first children and second and third children to colleges. And I've stayed in touch with my colleagues from then. They're orthodontists, and they're physicians, and they're engineers, and they're successful school teachers and business people. That, again, is the evolution of America, because America made an investment in itself and in its citizens. I think right now, for example, we're desperately in need of a public works project in America. And the bridges and the highways, 79th Street in New York. 79th Street in New York needs paving, right, Mike? So my original idea was when gasoline prices went down, put a nickel on the gas tax and put all that money in public works. We're spending $1 trillion on this war in the Middle East, between Iraq, Afghanistan, and now in Syria. $1 trillion at least, to say nothing of what we've spent in lives. It was the most disastrous public national security decision in the last 50 years, in my judgment, about the decision to invade and then not to find a way to resolve it finally. We could be spending some of that money here at home and giving people confidence again in America's ability to repair itself. That's how I feel.
And you think you can say that you can make a statement that strong because you're not affiliated?
Well, I can say that because, immodestly, and I kind of think I've earned the right. I don't mean to be boasting about it, but I've been out there for a long time. You talked about 9/11. On 9/11, it took everything I knew as a journalist, as a parent, as a husband, as a citizen to get through that day. And at 11 o'clock that morning, and I have never gone back and looked at the tape, but my friends talk about it when it's replayed. When the second tower went down, I looked into the camera and I said, this will change us. We're now at war. We have been attacked in the most orchestrated possible way, and it's going to be a different America from this day forward, or something to that effect. It just came out of me, and later people said, what prompted you to say that? And I said, I think it was just my training as a journalist and having lived here for a long time. And let me say as well that my colleagues at the other two networks, Peter at ABC and Dan at CBS, were doing extraordinary work on that day as well. It was a god-awful day, but it was a great tribute to the importance of serious journalism on the networks and on the cable channels, because it tied the country together. And that's what we do best under difficult circumstances.
Well, God bless you, Tom Brokaw.